This week in Billionaires, Elon Musk is on the verge of becoming the first person in history to amass an $800 billion fortune. This latest financial leap was fueled by a massive funding round for his artificial intelligence startup, xAI, which investors now value at $250 billion, more than double its previous worth. Musk is now $510 billion richer than the second wealthiest person on Earth, Google co-founder Larry Page. This milestone caps off a whirlwind year where Musk stepped back from the Trump administration to focus on business, saw his rocket company SpaceX hit an $800 billion valuation, and also won a court battle restoring $126 billion in Tesla stock options. However, xAI has burned through nearly $8 billion in cash in just 9 months and faces new lawsuits regarding fake images generated by its chatbot, Grok. Global markets were shaken by a diplomatic dispute when President Trump threatened a crushing 200% tariff on French wines and champagnes. Trump reportedly issued the ultimatum because French President Emmanuel Macron refused to participate in Trump's Gaza Board of Peace. The political standoff triggered a massive sell-off, erasing $12.5 billion in 24 hours from the fortune of Bernard Arnault, the CEO of luxury conglomerate LVMH, which includes brands like Moët & Chandon and Dom Perignon. The resulting tumble in LVMH shares significantly shrank the net worth of Arnault, Europe's richest man. The threat comes just days after Trump announced he would impose a sweeping 10% tariff on imports from 8 European countries, including France, over their refusal to back his push to take control of Greenland. President Donald Trump nominated David McNeil, the billionaire founder of auto accessories brand WeatherTech, to fill one of 3 open spots on the Federal Trade Commission. Forbes estimates McNeil is worth more than $4 billion, thanks largely to his 100% ownership of WeatherTech, making him the 12th billionaire or billionaire spouse set to join the Trump administration if his nomination is approved. McNeil has donated more than $3 million to Trump's campaigns, PACs, and inauguration committees, and is also a member of Trump's Mar-a-Lago Club in Palm Beach. Welcome to Beyond the Billions. I'm Giacomo Tognini at Forbes, and joining me today is Forbes Senior Editor Chris Helman. He's been covering the energy sector for more than 20 years. Chris, so great to have you on today for the first time, and hopefully not the last. And, you know, as someone who's had his finger on the pulse of all things oil and energy for so long, what do you think of the show Landmen? I haven't watched it myself, but, you know, curious to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I must be honest, I have never watched Landman. I am ashamed to say, because it is the big thing in my industry. But
Hmm.
I remember in my years at Forbes, I've interviewed some pretty significant landmen,
Right,
including
right.
the guy who I consider to be the greatest landman of all time, which was Aubrey McClendon of Chesapeake
Hmm.
Energy. He was very early in the shale boom, scooping up millions of acres across the Midwest and Pennsylvania that he turned into, a multi-billion-dollar fortune in natural gas and
Hmm.
oil before he died about 10 years ago. So I feel like to some extent I've lived it. I mean, that's kind of crazy, but I look forward to catching up.
Yeah, I mean, you've had so many fantastic stories covering these entrepreneurs over the years. I mean, you've seen, you know, the rise of the shale boom and all the different people who've made their money there and other shifts. And now in the last couple of years, especially the last year, you also had a great story recently with our colleague Phoebe about nuclear energy and how that's back in vogue now. There's the Trump administration's energy dominance agenda. I guess what are the biggest shifts you're seeing in energy now that have really piqued your interest?
In energy now, I'm fascinated, like you said, about the nuclear power industry.
Hmm.
Phoebe and I did that story about this small modular reactor
Hmm.
designers that are in vogue right now. We've seen tens of billions of dollars going into these
Right.
companies that are making reactors that about the size of an RV, for instance, and
Hmm.
and they'll be able to power a small town or a factory and enable these. What they're hoping to enable is set them up next to data centers. So if you have 10 small modular reactors powering a gigantic data center, that will alleviate the strain that the data center would otherwise have on the power grid. With the coming weather this weekend, there's probably going to be ice accumulations and power outages. So we need to have more redundancy in the power
Hmm.
grid. And I think that these small modular reactors are the way to do it, and they're going to create some billionaires along the way. We found some entrepreneurs who were
Hmm.
just so gung ho about mass producing these things. And over the next 10 or 20 years, they really do believe that they can shift the locus of power generation in America to nuclear again.
Hmm.
So, we could be looking at the next crop of billionaires, like you said.
Yeah, and I mean, you've covered sort of. You mentioned earlier you'd obviously interviewed Aubrey McClendon. You've also spoken with Harold Hamm, some of the other sort of biggest landmen and wildcatters of the industry. And the biggest news in the last few weeks in energy has not been nuclear, but it's been Venezuela and oil, right? So
Yes.
you've you've covered this. You did a great story with our colleague John on some of the financiers and people who might be winning out from that, and also you've done some other coverage before yourself. But what kind of struck you about it initially, and I know Harold Hamm was at that White House meeting with President Trump and some other oil executives, and he said that Venezuela interested him as an explorer, but we haven't had huge commitments. So what have you made of it? Yeah, I know you were reporting right out the gates after the news happened,
Yeah.
but
It's the most exciting time that I can remember in international oil exploration
mhm,
since the fall of Saddam Hussein, when the United States invaded Iraq. Like back then, I remember doing stories at the time of like who's going to be the first American wildcatters
mhm,
into Iraq, and it's funny to find the same kind of tropes and the same storylines emerge. Like who has the guts, who's crazy enough, who has this high risk capital that they're willing to put on the line. And we're starting to see that there's several billionaires and other very rich people who are looking to
mhm,
explore, including there's Jeffrey Hildebrand. He's a Houston oil man who owns Hillcorp Energy. They're very big in Alaska and throughout the United States. They often go into these older fields that need rehabilitation, which
mhm,
Venezuela has a lot of. One guy I'm really trying to learn more about. His name is Bill Armstrong of Armstrong Oil and Gas. He has made a career and a fortune by finding new oil fields and then selling them off to other people. He's
mhm,
made some enormous discoveries in Alaska over the past few decades that have yielded billions of dollars worth of asset sales. And I didn't even realize really until the Venezuela invasion and
mhm.
capture of Maduro that Armstrong had millions of acres offshore Venezuela, not in
Wow.
Venezuelan waters, but next to it in Aruba and Curacao. So I guess he was already thinking ahead, and he has this giant exploration area to go look for oil in the same trend that ExxonMobil has been so
Mhm.
successful. Because right north of there is Guyana, and ExxonMobil has found billions upon billions of barrels of
Right.
producible oil there. So it's a wonderful time for these stories. We're going to see some great fortunes emerge, some amazing entrepreneur tales that we'll try to get into all of them in Forbes in the months to come.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Also, as a strategy, I guess. So you're saying Armstrong, it's more of sort of a trading strategy as opposed to actually developing the fields himself and
Yeah, I think he
keeping them
gets
for a
off
long time.
on finding it in the first place.
Yeah.
He doesn't want the trouble or the expense of going out and drilling all of those developmental wells
Yeah.
and putting in the pipelines. That's something that's better for an ExxonMobil. And you saw at that meeting at the White House how unenthusiastic Darren Woods, the CEO of ExxonMobil,
Hmm.
was. He's like, we don't really want to go in there. We lost so much money in Venezuela before. Some people call him, anti-patriotic or whatever, but he's just
Hmm.
being a smart businessman. And he knows that if Armstrong finds some mega field off of Venezuela, so it's nothing to Exxon to step in and pay $2 or $3 billion for it,
Right.
just to take it over. And but they don't need the risk in the meantime. So yeah, it's going to be really fun. I'm trying to get an interview with Harold Hamm to see what his thoughts are. Hamm recently surprised me by making some investments in Argentina. So he's going
Hmm.
to be drilling for Shale in Argentina, and he also has a venture in Turkey. So here at the end of Harold Hamm's career, he's done some amazing things in recent days. He announced last week that he was shutting in all of his rigs in the Bakken field in
Hmm.
North Dakota. So after making his fortune in the Bakken field, he's like, prices are too low to justify drilling there. And instead, he's going to Turkey and Argentina and thinking about maybe Venezuela. So, he's still very active.
Yeah, always a fascinating one to watch. And it's interesting. We just talked about the exploration possibilities. Then there's also sort of the other parts of the value chain where things are already moving. And you reported on, along with John Hyatt, the recent sale, I guess late last year, of Citgo, which was
Yes.
sort of the Venezuelan government's sort of refining arm, right? Or they have refineries and gas stations in the U.S. Could you unpack that a little bit for us and sort of what that deal looked like and how they stand to
Yeah,
profit?
it's such a fascinating deal that was in the works for a decade now.
Hmm.
It's not like they suddenly jumped on the opportunity after the
Right.
invasion. But okay, so Citgo is the like you said, it's the U.S. refining arm of Petróleos de Venezuela,
Hmm.
PDVSA. But years ago, after the Chavez regime started nationalizing the assets of American oil companies and international oil companies in Venezuela, they decided to fight back. And so, in this case, we have ConocoPhillips and many other creditors who ended up getting they will end up controlling Citgo
Hmm.
to try to make good on the tens of billions of dollars that they're still owed by PDVSA and by
Hmm.
Venezuela. So in the end, we have Elliott Management, which is run by Paul Singer, a billionaire.
Hmm.
They're going to be bidding $6 billion to buy Citgo and its three refineries and take over that asset. And that money will ultimately go to pay off these nationalizations that happened years
Right.
ago. And it's going to be really fascinating to see what happens to the Citgo refineries because when they were built, they were optimized for this really thick, heavy Venezuelan
Hmm.
crude oil that needed, really heavy cokers and hydrotreaters, big machinery to break it down into gasoline and jet fuel. But then when sanctions went in on Venezuela, those refineries were no longer able to get the
Right.
Venezuelan crude that they were accustomed to. So, Elliott Management and its partners had been working on this a long time, probably not counting on getting a new access to Venezuelan oil. But the
Hmm.
way it's going to turn out, they probably will, and so they can, revert the machines to that optimized status
Hmm.
that they were before, and hopefully, for the investors, hopefully they'll make a really good margin on the fuel that they can generate. So that's another one of those entrepreneur-driven stories where it's just amazing that they were in the right place in the right time to get control of what was Venezuela's crown jewel
Hmm.
energy assets in the United States. This is a really big deal. So they're still fighting over it. The deal's not closed yet, but it should close in the next few months, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating with the timing. Obviously, that they couldn't have foreseen that. I guess, is there now with sort of the change in relations, right, between the U.S. and Venezuela? Is that jeopardizing the deal at all? The fact that the government
I,
there is now
I haven't heard any word
collaborating.
of that yet, but it could happen, right? So I
Right.
think the White House the other day said that the oil companies should not, really think too hard about getting paid back what they think Venezuela owes them. It's
Mm.
not like the White House is going to start selling Venezuelan oil and then, turning around and giving money to ConocoPhillips or
Mm.
ExxonMobil or whoever else is owed
Right.
these billions of dollars. They're going to be pushed to the back of the line so that that oil money can go towards reinvigorating the Venezuelan
Right.
oil industry. So, maybe the same thing will happen to the Citgo assets. The White House could say, oh, it's really important that after all that PDVSA retains these refineries, so we're gonna, put the kibosh on this whole bankruptcy auction process. Who knows? I mean, it's within the realm of possibility. Anything is, considering what's been
Yeah.
happening in recent months.
Yeah. Of course. And I mean, I'm looking at the sums that will be needed, right, to bring Venezuela even close to what it used to produce. I mean, I believe right now Chevron's the only U.S. oil company, right, that has a license to export. I believe they said they could increase production by around 50% in the next sort of 12 to 18 months. But then there's been estimates, I think one they cited was $100 billion over, up to 4 years to bring the fields back. Obviously, it's still early to tell, but what's your thoughts on, how long it might take to actually get to those levels?
It is too early to tell. It's going to
Hmm.
be really, really expensive. And I think that they just want to be optimistic right now, but we need to
Right.
look at the effect of, what happened after the invasion of Libya, what
Hmm.
happened after the invasion of Iraq. Production fell
Right.
for a while before it bottomed out and then slowly came back up again. So all of these prognostications that Venezuela is suddenly going to find more and more oil to produce, I hope, perhaps that will be the case. But recent history shows that it could go the other way as well, just as easily. So,
Hmm.
I hear these numbers of $100 billion over 10 years that would be needed to get production up to 1.5 million barrels per day, or I don't know. That it's all over the place. We'll
Right.
we'll see what happens. Um, I'm really curious what happens to the Chinese companies that were already in there.
Hmm.
There were quite a few, Chinese government connected entities that had already taken over fields,
Hmm.
and were at least doing some engineering work in Venezuela. Also, Russian engineers, I believe. So there's all sorts of other moving parts to that mess. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's also interesting looking at the price of oil right now, right? I mean, uh, quick disclosure, like my father was in oil and gas exploration for many years, and his, the with all around what, 50, $60 it is now.
Yeah.
That's quite low for some of the expensive sort of deep water exploration you might need to do in Venezuela. So how does that play into these projections now? The fact that is it when you're talking to these drillers and people in the industry, how much does that play into it? The fact of where the oil price is now and how that impacts investment decisions.
Yeah. I think that feeds into the pessimism that we saw from the likes of ExxonMobil in that meeting.
Yeah.
The idea is that the price is too low. We can't even justify drilling in the United States, where we have the
Right.
rule of law, we have the sanctity of contracts, we
Hmm.
know where the stuff is, we have all the companies and workers lined up ready to do the job, and we still
Hmm.
have Harold Hamm saying, "I'm not going to drill in North Dakota anymore. The price is too low." So
Right.
I've seen numbers recently that suggest you would need to be getting $90 a barrel in order to justify new work in Venezuela.
Hmm.
Just, virgin exploration and development in parts of Venezuela that, they just haven't been worked on for one reason or another. $90 a barrel might get the job done. Um, I don't think anyone who's interested in Venezuela believes that oil prices will stay as low as they are right now.
Hmm.
I feel that a lot of that has to do with sanctions. We find that once the sanctions come off, the global oil price will end up going up
Hmm.
because Russia has been selling oil for $20 or $30 below
Right.
indexes. Venezuela was doing the same. Venezuela had to give up most of its crude oil to China to make good on debts that they had incurred in some cases decades ago. So once all of that's cleared up, we could see the price of oil rise quite quite rapidly, especially if you consider the effect that inflation has had
Hmm.
in integrating the value of the dollar, and pair that with gold. I don't think we've ever had a time in our lives where you can get so many barrels of oil per ounce of gold, or even
Hmm.
silver. It used to be you'd be crazy to think that you could get a barrel of oil for the same price as an ounce of silver, but now silver is worth more than oil. It's kind of messed up. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We're obviously talking in terms of commodities, but then when it comes down to the what people end up seeing at the gas pump, right? The price of a barrel of oil might be low, but due to inflation and a whole host of other factors, right, that price that actual consumers pay hasn't really come down much, right?
Well, I don't know. Here in Texas, our gas price has been under $3 for a while now. So on an inflation adjusted basis, that's pretty good because we were still, that's something that we would have been paying, back in 2020 when oil
Yeah,
price was even cheaper. Um, I don't know. I feel like oil prices are artificially low right now. If you can't justify additional drilling, then eventually the supply will decline to meet demand, and something will go wrong. That's why it's always going to be a cyclical business, like any
right,
commodity extraction business. It'll go wrong at some point in the cycle.
right. I mean, there's so much to watch out for in oil. Obviously, you also mentioned Russia. If there is a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, ending of sanctions and the price cap, that would have an impact. But you've covered, you know, oil and gas, nuclear. I know you've covered hydrogen entrepreneurs before. There's talk of, fusion as well, nuclear fusion technology. If you had to sort of look out at the next year or two, what are the biggest energy stories you're looking out for and trying to get into as a reporter?
Well, let me give you two things. One, to finish off with oil, I think the number of new oil related billionaires that we're finding, even at a time of cheap $60 oil,
Hmm.
is kind of surprising to me.
Right.
I'm starting to work on a story about a really fascinating Dallas family called the Huddlestons, who last week they sold their oil and gas company Aethon Energy to
Hmm.
Mitsubishi for $7 billion. So they didn't own all of that, but they got a portion of it, and it looks like the family's probably a billionaire family, especially when you consider the background. They're in Dallas, and the Huddleston. Okay, it's Gordon Huddleston's wife, Mary, is the daughter of Nelson Bunker Hunt. We were
Hmm.
talking about
Yeah.
silver a couple minutes ago. Nelson
Right.
Bunker Hunt, maybe, some people may remember him because 40 years ago he tried to corner the market on
Hmm.
silver. And that ended very poorly for him, and he
Right.
lost a lot
Right.
of money, but it was a great attempt. And he was the son of H.L. Hunt, who was one of the biggest oil magnates of all
Hmm.
time. One
Legendary wildcatter.
yeah,
Right.
he
Yeah.
was thought to be the richest man in the world. So, now I'm like, wow, this is an old oil fortune family that just made a new fortune selling to Mitsubishi, just a different kinds of fields. They're doing shale, they're doing a lot of gas rather than
Hmm.
oil. There's a lot of fortunes being made out there. And I'll finish with, back to nuclear. I think nuclear power is going to be an amazing growth story over the next 15 years. Um, People who care about carbon emissions finally understand now that the best way to reduce carbon emissions is to get more of our power from nuclear, and
Right.
wherever possible, replace things like coal-fired generation and natural gas generation with nuclear because it's reliable, it's around the clock. Once you get it going, it's very, very efficient. The challenge has been the engineering that it takes to shrink these machines, and also the
Hmm.
permitting and the regulation that it takes to get new prototypes and pilot plants built. We're finally breaking through a lot of that. There's some fascinating new reactors that will go critical by July 4th of this year, in time
Hmm.
for the nation's 250th
Right.
anniversary, that I'm pretty excited about. And there's also a lot of work um, around putting new reactors on federal facilities like
Hmm.
military sites and our national labs. So to get around regulation, it looks like the Department of Energy will be pushing entrepreneurs and startups to build their small modular reactor on these protected federal sites. And again, what they want to do is also have big data centers on these
Hmm.
sites. So they'll end up with, federally sited giant data centers powered by the next generation of nuclear. And once it's proven out on federal lands with federal backing, then hopefully these systems will be ready for the rest of the world. If they can prove it out, it'd be great for us all. So that's where my head's at this year.
Chris, as always, it's been so great. I learned so much from you every time, and thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Giacomo. Good to see you.
As always, you can find Chris's stories and the other stories we mentioned in today's episode in the show notes.